Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. I've been asked by a student to do a lesson on the concept of contestability. So back to theme 3, theory of the firm. Okay, and we're just going to do something on contestability. It'll take about 10 minutes. Okay, you know the score by now. If you want to participate in Coffee with Mr. V, go and grab yourself a coffee or your favorite liquid, put it in a mug, a glass, or a cup, and then come back to me. And then we are going to do the synchronized sip together. So when you're ready, 3, 2, 1, here we go. I love coffee. So contestability, what does it actually mean? For those of you doing Edexcel A-level, you will find this in 3.4.7 contestability. Okay, it's one of those concepts that actually punches well above its weight in terms of exams, comes up a lot more than you would perhaps expect for something which is a relatively small part of the specification. I just thought I'd put these words up here. There's lots of words that kind of begin with CO in theory of the firm, very similar in their meaning, but actually do have different meanings. And sometimes students get them confused or think that they're synonyms. I mean, they are not. Okay, so I've got contestability at the top, and contestability is really just about barriers of entry and exit, and how easy it is for firms or not, how easy or not it is for firms, new firms, to enter a market. Okay, so we're really asking ourselves there about barriers to entry. Do we think that firms will find it easy to enter markets, or do we think that they'll find it very difficult? Will they struggle? If they're finding it easy, you can call it a contestable market. If they would struggle to enter a new firm, you would call it uncontestable. Competition then is the number of firms in a particular market. So we call a market structure that has lots of firms in the market as very competitive. Okay, there's lots of competition within the market, but a monopoly, on the other hand, market structure where there's only one firm, or if it's an oligopoly, 2 firms, we would say it's very uncompetitive. Okay, there's not a lot of competition. Concentration then buys into this idea of a concentration ratio. How much of the market is concentrated into the market share of the largest couple of firms. Okay, so they're similar things, but they're not quite the same thing, and that's what you have to kind of bear in mind. Okay, so if this is our market, let's give it a visualization. Okay, competition is simply kind of how many firms are in that market. You know, if there's 100 firms in the market, then we would talk about competition. Concentration, on the other hand, is kind of looking at it from the other scenario, which is here's our big 2 firms, and how much of the market is squeezed into that. So I don't know how I would represent this, but maybe I would do sort of like a Venn diagram, and I'd say, well, if maybe I should have drawn it with a different color. If the green blobs kind of represent the 2 largest firms in the market, and the blue blob represents the number of consumers in that market, you can see that actually this isn't a very particularly concentrated market, because only a relatively small part of the market is actually accounted for by those 2 large firms. Okay, so that's what we mean by concentration. Contestability, on the other hand, is simply, right, here's my market. How easy is it for a new firm to join that market? Okay, so those are some of the things that I would think about. Again, something I'm all very keen to do is try and put the different market structures onto a spectrum like this, with perfect competition at one end and monopoly at the other end. And this is definitely a competition spectrum. So over here, you only have 1 firm in the market, and over here we have lots and lots of firms on the market. Now, it is very likely that contestability will improve as we move to the right of that spectrum, because what you would expect is, if barriers to entry are low, if it's very easy for new firms to enter the market, then surely there are likely to be more firms in the market by the time you get to this end. But it doesn't have to be so. And this is the reason that I think sometimes students get confused with the idea of contestability, just because a market structure is contestable, that doesn't automatically mean that it is a highly competitive market. It doesn't automatically mean there are lots of firms in there. It just means that the behavior of the incumbent firms in there is likely to change. But I'll come into that later on. So if I look at the specification about contestable market, this is what it says. It says that there should be no barriers to entry or exit. There should be no sunk costs. Sunk costs, remember, are the costs that a firm spends in order to get started. Okay, they're costs that won't ever be recovered. So the greater the sunk costs, the more contestable it is. Let's give an example. For example, a hairdressers. I always have that example in class. You know, sometimes I pose that to the class. If we wanted to start up a hairdressers, how much do we really think that would cost to set up? You'd need to find some premises, but you wouldn't need to necessarily buy it. You would just need to kind of rent it. If you didn't have to do any major structural work, what would you need to buy in? A couple of mirrors, a couple of chairs, definitely some equipment and some products, and then obviously hiring the staff if you're not skilled yourself enough to do it, and you have a hairdressers. And realistically, how much is that potentially costing you? Well, it's in the low thousands, I would have thought, again, unless you're doing major structural work. On the other hand, let's compare that to a nuclear power plant. Probably you've got to spend billions of pounds to build your nuclear power plant before you can even turn it on. So you can see hopefully the difference between sunk costs in those two particular industries at the very end. You've got a hairdressers, which may only cost you £5,000, maybe not even that, depending on where you get your materials from, or you've got a nuclear power plant, which is potentially costing you billions. So that's what a sunk cost is. Same technology. What we're saying is that the most contestable market would mean that all firms within that market would have access to the same technology, whether that's a particular payment system, whether it's a particular piece of technology that goes into making the product, everybody would have access to it. And then it also has this thing that says there is no competitive disadvantage to new firms, which is kind of a very loose, general, kind of vague thing that's just whacked in there, but we can kind of talk about it. The thing for me is, though, even though the spec has kind of put this into 4 separate bullet points, I kind of feel like all of these bullet points down here are just the same as that one. We're just talking about barriers to entry here. Okay, sunk costs for me are a barrier to entry. The higher the sunk cost, the greater the barrier to entry. There are low barriers to entry for the hairdressing industry. There are very high barriers to entry for the nuclear power industry. So I would see that as a barrier to entry. The same level of technology, again, I would see that as a barrier to entry, because of course, if you have patents, a patent is a legal protection of your technology, which means that no other firm can use your technology. Well, if you have patents in a particular industry, or maybe you have licensing of particular technology, then that would be a barrier to entry. Okay, so that I would see that one. And then this one, which doesn't really have, is quite a vague term in and of itself anyway. Well, let's think about something like brand loyalty. I mean, if you were to join a new market and there was brand loyalty in the market, then that would put you at a competitive disadvantage. So brand loyalty would also be a barrier to entry. So personally, I think you just need to concept of contestability with the concept of barriers to entry, and how high are the barriers to entry in a particular market. Now, barriers to entry are simply obstacles that limits a firm's ability to enter, set up, or extend into new markets. Some barriers to entry are simply structural for a particular industry. So you have structural barriers. These are just barriers that are naturally occurring within a particular market. The nuclear power one is a very, very good example. Okay, by the very nature of the industry, okay, you would have huge sunk costs. Okay, there's no other way to get into the nuclear power industry than building your nuclear power plant by training huge amounts of staff, and therefore it's very, very expensive. That's a huge barrier to entry. On the other hand, we have what we call behavioral barriers to entry. Okay, behavioral barriers to entry are barriers to entry that have been deliberately erected by incumbent firms to stop new firms coming into the market. Okay, so difference there between behavioral and structural. So a good example of a behavioral market, a behavioral barrier to entry, might be something like brand loyalty, but it also might be something like market saturation. So a good example of that is Kellogg's. Kellogg's literally do every type of cereal you can imagine, which means there is no market niche for any other cereal manufacturer to explore. Okay, another one might be Colgate and toothpaste. Okay, any different type of toothpaste that you can think of, Colgate already does it. There is no part of the market left open for anybody else to kind of exploit. And that's what we call market saturation, saturating the market with your products so that there is no space left for anybody else. Cadbury's and chocolate manufacturers are, again, very, very similar. Okay, you can't think of a chocolate bar that Cadbury's doesn't already do or hasn't already done that we can sort of that we could certainly gain mass appeal. Advertising as well might be a behavioral barrier to entry. Okay, there's nothing structural, there's nothing natural about that. But the more I advertise, the more brand loyalty I build, and therefore the harder it is for somebody else to enter the market. So if I'm sort of advising you on how to answer questions about contestability, first of all, the question might be something about identify whether this is a contestable market or a non-contestable market. And then I guess I might be asking you to link contestability to some of the other concepts. So as I said before, it's very likely that a highly contestable market will lead to a highly competitive market. If there are low barriers to entry, then it kind of builds into the characteristics that we have of perfect competition. And then when you're asked about the behavior of particular firms in that market, then you can just go, well, what is the behavior of firms in perfect competition? Well, they need to produce at P equals AC or AC equals AR. Yeah, I've got that right. Basically, they need to be making normal profit because if they're making supernormal profit, then that's going to attract new firms into the market and eat away at their supernormal profit. Okay, so we would expect that highly contestable markets become highly competitive markets, and therefore they are the markets that are most likely to get to normal profit. On the other hand, I could talk about how if I was in a highly contestable market, I'd be working my socks off to try and make it as contestable as possible. So I would be happy if there were suddenly government licenses, as long as I would be happy to go down the route of protecting my own intellectual property. So IP law, yeah, I would be patenting, I would be trademarking, I would be making sure that other firms didn't have access to the same technology. I would be putting my stamp on my brand and saying, yeah, you can't use the logo. Okay, so I would be working really, really hard to try and make it as uncontestable as possible. Potentially with sunk costs as well. Once you're established in the market, you might actually lobby the government for more stricter laws so that actually it becomes harder, it becomes more expensive for new firms to enter the market, so you don't get these hit and run firms that just come into the market, steal the profit and then leave. Okay, you would be actively doing things, behaving in a certain way to build up the barriers around your market. And quite closely linked to this, I'm going to get it the wrong way around now, is limit pricing as well. Limit pricing strategies is the sort of thing that I would be involved in. Limit pricing means that you put your prices down to such a level that actually new firms can't just come in and steal your market share because it would be unprofitable for them to do so. Okay, so these are the things that I would be thinking about with a question. These are the things that I would do. I can't afford. It's unlikely that I would be able to make supernormal profit. Okay, and the second thing is that I would probably be working quite hard to impose barriers of my own, behavioral barriers to entry. And then lastly, I did say that just because you are contestable doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be competitive. All right. So a really good example of this is something like the sportswear market. All right. We know that this is an oligopoly. We know that it is dominated by very large firms, Nike, Adidas. But as you'll also know, Under Armour has come from relative obscurity over the last 10 years and is now the third largest sportswear company on the planet. Okay. Well, they've come from somewhere. So that must mean to some extent that they got over the barriers to entry in the sportswear market, despite the millions and millions upon millions that Nike and Adidas use to kind of both patent their new technology and to advertise and make sure that they have all the best sponsorship deals. Somebody still managed to get through. And if I think about the sportswear industry, I actually think, well, how hard would it be to set up my own sportswear brand? What sunk costs? I mean, what would I do? I'd go on Alibaba.com. I'd buy 100 T-shirts, bulk buying. I'll go and print a logo on it. Okay, GeorgeSports.com or whatever it might be, and then I'd start flogging it. And suddenly, I am actively in the sportswear market. It wasn't that difficult. So I would see the sportswear market as, well, particularly in some cases, having relatively low barriers to entry. I mean, I guess the advertising is quite a high barrier to entry, but apart from that, I think you struggle to find where the other big ones are. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do particularly well in the market. I'm not saying I'd make loads of money, but I was able to enter the market relatively quickly. So contestable markets don't always need to be highly competitive markets. But what it is saying is that Nike and Adidas are doing their utmost to try and make it harder. Okay, so what did we say? They're advertising, they're trying to patent things. They're also trying to move their technology on quickly, very quickly. These are very highly dynamically efficient industries, firms. They're always trying to come up with new technologies. Look at like Nike's new running shoe, where they're trying to run the marathon in 2 hours. Okay, all of this technology, because again, they want to move the market forward and make it harder for new incumbent firms to come in and steal that market share away. So they're actively trying to build barrier entry. So that's what I would be thinking about in terms of exams. Anyway, I'm going to end it here because I think I've said it as much as I can say about contestability. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you again next time. Bye.